Alright, so this is my process for the Firefly Princess, and I got the idea of doing this when I was looking at Howard Lyons, one of his witches, and it's an 8x10, and my goal to this process was basically to see if I can do something that small with as much detail as possible. And so I first basically used Howard's reference. He gave it to us as part of his Patreon. So the first thing I did was start blocking it out. I just created a line drawing. I used some sepia with some mineral spirits. So after the line work was in, I basically started filling out the highlights first. And I know you're supposed to do the shadows first, but I wanted to get a good idea of my base mid-tone first. And from there, I wanted to just kind of fill in and block in everything as a whole. And you'll notice that I'm painting the cutoff of the dress as well as the same color. I wanted that uniformity. And then what I'm doing is I'm going in and adding in my darks. Now, I felt like doing it this way would give me a better idea of total contrast. I have a tendency to go really stark white and stark black, so high contrast. And I wanted to get a little bit more of that mid-tone in there. So I figured having that dark in there with the light already defined is going to help me kind of even out the tones a little bit more. And I think it worked well in my case. And then I'm going in and I'm painting the hair. I'm using burnt umber, very dark mix of blue and red with my burnt umber to get my solid blacks in. And I'm pretty much following the base information of the reference image and using that to its full capacity. I'm then filling in the solid tones. I'm not worried about the highlights in this because I'm more focused on getting an average going on. And now with that in place, I'm going to use more of a raw umber with some white and some yellow ochre in there to ultimately start filling in the rest of the colors of the hair. And you'll notice that at this stage of the game, I'm using straight yellow ochre and pretty much primary tubes of paint. I feel that this is a kind of better idea than kind of going straight in with the model tones. I'm working more about this as a primary layer than I am working about it as anything else. That's my focus point is get the primary colors down and kind of block that out. Now, once I get the primary color in there and a little bit of the backdrop, I'm not too worried about the background, but I start putting a base coat of background color in. I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and viridian green and things like that to kind of get my overall base tone. And what I'm doing is I'm trying not to, I have a tendency to like make things even, so I'm trying to add a little bit more gradient. So you'll notice I go in with a lot darker color on the bottom here and start building that in right off the bat. I'm using a smaller brush, and I'm doing this because I want those brush strokes in there. Using a larger brush is going to get rid of that little bit of chaos, and I think that adding that chaos in there adds quite a bit. Now you'll notice I really haven't touched the midtones or the shadows at all from a color standpoint, but you'll notice that with the lights and the darks in there, that facial shadow highlights quite a bit, so it's not nearly as dark as it was originally with the two colors. And I think that a lot has that to do with the white tones, and so getting those white tones in there makes a huge difference. I'm going in and adding a little bit of green into the eye shadow area and slowly starting to just kind of smooth out the shadows and things like that. I'm going in with a smaller brush, and to keep a steady hand I'm using the base of the easel to rest my hand on. And the biggest thing at this size, so this is 8x10, so the head's about a little bit less than 1.5 inches. So at this point, you'll notice a lot of it is just going in and adding a little bit of paint and then blending it together. So at this point, you'll see that I'm pretty much going in and just really manipulating and pushing on the pixels of the painting. I'm going back and forth, and I've got a little one brush that I'm using and just bouncing back and forth between my paint palette and adding in little tone values back and forth. I'm ultimately using something and kind of working in such a small scale that ultimately it's just pushing paint back and forth. And you'll notice as I do this, or as I keep doing this, I'm just adding in little bits of paint. Now if I go too dark, I have to kind of pull things out and push things back and forth. And you'll notice that just adding that little bit of darkness kind of really distorts the facial shape. I think that's a key aspect of paying attention to that, is watching your light and value contrast. And you'll notice eventually I'll go back through and manipulate that so it's not as dark. Now from here, I'm ultimately grabbing a bigger brush, and it's kind of spread out, it's kind of worn down, and I'm just using that brush to kind of blend shapes together. And it really helps me blend the larger areas back and forth. And you'll notice I go back and forth between the big brush and the smaller brush and kind of add in a little color with the smaller brush and try and define it a little bit more. And then at this point, I'm going in with even a smaller brush, I think it's a 0.20, and I'm just tapping in little bits of color in order to get the highlights and stuff like that in the eyes and in the mouth. And basically what I'm doing is I'm just going through and adding in little bits of color changes and trying to get that form of the face going on. I'm trying to get it so it's not flattening out too much. And as you can see from the enlarged version of it, I'm really doing very subtlety strokes. It's very small and putting in little things one at a time. You'll see me add in a big splotch of color someplace and then use a brush to kind of spread it out. So like I'll add a little bit of red to the cheek and I'm kind of blending right on the canvas. As far as the canvas goes, I'm using a ampersand smooth panel, and so ultimately what I'm doing is I'm adding a little highlights and then I'm blending it in. I'm adding a little bit of, I'm trying to spread out that high contrast and just getting in a little bit of subtle form, and that's simple value changes, changing in, adding in a little bit more white, adding in a little bit more color, darkening it up, and I'm using just a brown to darken the piece. Now at an 8x10, as I mentioned before, the head is about 1.5 inches, maybe close to 2 inches. And so I'm using really small brushes. I'm adding in a little bit of paint and then I'm just kind of blending it down. I'm trying to do very subtle changes in order to get the better kind of form and feeling of it. And so you'll notice if I go outside of it and make a mistake, I'm grabbing I'm wiping the brush off, and I'm basically using the paint on top of it to kind of push away the mistake. One of the things that, from working on oil to digital, you don't have that undo. So this is a kind of a struggle sometimes when you make that mistake. I've already been painting and I accidentally move the brush and it hits the painting, and then I've got to wipe it out, and it gives you the idea of solving the issues that you're working on. And you'll notice that one of the things is when you're doing this, a lot of the stuff that I'm learning or I'm doing here, I've learned from doing plein air painting and life drawing. When you're doing that type of thing, you're ultimately having to fix things on the fly, and that comes in really handy when you try and fix things, on a painting standpoint. You'll notice, like I said, I'm really zooming up in there, getting that real small tiny brush, and just ultimately adding a little bit of highlight and blending it in, adding a little bit of something else, and adding and blending it, and so on and so forth. So you can see here that I'm ultimately just kind of pushing in and blending a lot of my mistakes away. I'm trying to get a little bit more lost edges, and you'll see I'm working on the bigger piece here, and ultimately trying to get that kind of smoothed out. I'm really trying to focus on rounding out her face, not having those hard shadows in there. And at this size, it's kind of a tedious bit of information. And as you notice, I'm just kind of going through and adding in a little bit more of the highlights along the chest and in the shoulder and stuff like that. And so it's ultimately trying to get that kind of value system to keep going. You'll notice that the dark shadows of the hair are a little bit too dark, so I need to add some mid-tones in to kind of pull that out. And you'll notice I'm just going through and kind of now here I'm adding a little bit more darks to ultimately kind of slide in and kind of even out that hair a little bit more. I don't want it super dark, but I feel like the hair itself should be a little bit more value toned. And you'll see like I'm adding a yellow ochre blend here to kind of flesh out the hair and kind of balance it out a little bit more. So that basically evens out my shadows a little bit more, and you'll notice that I'm going in and adding a little bit of shadows. And I use my finger to blend. I'm using brushes, and sometimes brushes give you such a hard edge no matter what you do, that I find that adding those little bits of paint do quite a bit. And here I'm adding in the highlights in the hair, and I'm really focusing on the face and the hair more than anything else in this piece right now. It's the most amount of detail, and everything else around there just kind of has this structure of, that's my focal point. And with the halo around there, everything is going to be drawn to there. So I don't need as much detail in everywhere else. And ultimately, I'm just going through the hair and adding in little bits of dark shadows and things like that. So one of the big things I have a tendency to do is that I go through and I'm going through and basically adding in, like, trying not to duplicate things. I have a tendency to make things very even, and you'll see that in the ringlets of the hair. And so as I'm working on this, I want the dress is a sequin dress, and I don't want necessarily sequins, but I want to give it a little more fantasy feel. So I'm adding in a little bit of shadows to the chainmail. Now, I don't have any real reference I'm using. I'm just kind of going off of, what I think I want. And I don't want as much detail, but I just want a little bit of the shadow from the hanging of the chainmail. And so I'm just using a raw sienna, really dark brown, to ultimately kind of go through and add in those little bitty details. And you'll notice in the shadows here, I don't even add that much in there. I'm just adding very subtle highlights. I'm using that red base to reflect on the gold. And so ultimately what I'm doing is I'm just adding in a pattern, but I'm not trying to make it 100% perfect. Like, eventually some of this stuff is going to fade out and I'm not going to see it at all. Alright, so as I continue to work on this, basically I'm going in and I'm adding in a little bit more detail in the eyes. It was too wet to ultimately add it while I was doing it, and at some point I needed to fix the eye level. It was a little bit off, so I needed to adjust some of that as well. So you'll see me here with just basically a little bit of paint and adding just little touches here and there. Then what I'm going to do is really kind of focus on getting the eyes kind of even, make sure they look okay. And ultimately I'm trying to get that amount of detail in such a small spot. I'm just adding a little bit of highlight to just pop out the eyes, make them look a little bit more wet, and I'm just trying to get the underside of the eye. Now I'm going to go back and work on more of this little piece here on the edge of the dress here. And so I'm kind of basing it off of the Wonder Woman kind of thing, putting a couple V's in there. I'm trying to keep a repetitive pattern, so I'll make a V for the necklace here, and I'm just using a little bit of yellow ochre and some browns to kind of push that in. And so ultimately just painting in solid colors and trying to get a nice solid base going on. At this point it's dry, so I have no issues going in and adding in those little bits of pieces. Next thing I'm doing is adding in a little bit of details in the necklace, adding some highlights, adding some just kind of repetitive patterns to kind of give me more of that fantasy feel, as well as to give me a little sense of kind of unifying the design. And I'm going through and I'm adding in a little bit more hair strands, and everything's dry now at this point, so I'm going in on top of it and just adding little real thin pieces of hair, and kind of adding in little bits and pieces there, popping in highlights and things like that. With that in mind, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the fabric, and it's very flat right now, so I need to kind of pop out the highlights and put a little bit more form in the edge of it as well. At this point I'm going to speed up the video a little bit more, and so ultimately I'm going through and adding in more strands of hair. I'm adding in highlights, I'm adding in just kind of those detail things that I see that needs to be kind of adjusted. And I'm working on kind of unifying the tones a little bit more, kind of pushing in a little bit more shading, especially in fabric, especially in tones like that. I'm even going into the armor and adding in more detail in there, more shadows, a little bit more highlights, especially under the chest area and the abdominal wall. Pushing in the darks a little bit more into the background to kind of push her down and give it a little bit more weight. And I'm adding in a little bit more kind of base flats to kind of even out the design of the scale mail. And so that way it's not like super in your face. I'm just making it really kind of rough and kind of simplistic. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of go in and add in little highlights and push things a little bit further. Now, I'm adding a little bit more chest to kind of give her a little bit more bosom, and kind of blending out a little bit of the highlights as well. I'm going in and adding in some rough edges to kind of get rid of this round circle, and I think that works really well. And I'm adding in a little bit more darks and stuff like that, and I'm adding in a little blob of paint and then doing a spiral around it to create the Firefly effect. I'm keeping it ultimately pretty simple, and that's pretty much the painting as a whole. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.